The summer sun beat down on Pine Oak Street as 12-year-old Sophia Chen put the finishing touches on her lemonade stand. She had spent all morning making her grandmother's special recipe, cutting fresh lemons and adding just the right amount of honey instead of sugar. A hand-painted sign hung from the front of the folding table: "Lemonade $1. All money goes to Riverside Animal Shelter." Sophia wiped sweat from her forehead and adjusted her ponytail. This was her third summer running the stand, but the first time she was doing it for charity. Her dog Pepper had been adopted from Riverside, and after seeing a post about their need for supplies, she wanted to help. First customer of the day called Mrs. Wilson from next door, fishing in her purse for change. "It's too hot to be gardening anyway." Sophia carefully poured the lemonade, making sure not to spill. "I put extra ice in yours," she said with a smile, handing over the paper cup. As the afternoon went on, business picked up. The Henderson twins bought 2 cups each, and Mr. Lee from the bookstore stopped by with his grandson. By 3 o'clock, Sophia had already made $27. She was counting the money when a white and blue police car pulled up to the curb. The car door opened, and Officer Derek Hayes stepped out. He was tall with broad shoulders and a face that looked like it rarely smiled. His uniform was pressed perfectly, and his sunglasses hid his eyes as he walked toward the lemonade stand. Sophia straightened up. "Would you like some lemonade, sir? It's for the animal shelter." Officer Hayes didn't look at the lemonade. Instead, he scanned the table, the sign, and the small catch box. "Do you have a permit for this?" he asked, his voice sharp. Sophia's smile faded. "A permit?" "Yes, a permit. You need a business permit and a food handler's license to sell food or drinks to the public." Officer Hayes took out a small notebook. "This is a violation of City Code 47.3. A few people had stopped to watch. Mrs. Wilson, who had been working in her garden again, put down her trowel and walked over. "Officer, she's just a child raising money for charity," Mrs. Wilson said. Officer Hayes ignored her. "What's your name?" he asked Sophia. "Sophia Chen," she answered quietly, her voice shaking a little. "Well, Sophia Chen, ignorance of the law is no excuse." He tore a page from his notebook and handed it to her. "This is a citation for operating without proper permits. The fine is $150. Sophia dragged her wagon up the driveway of the modest 2-story house she shared with her dad. Usually, she'd burst through the front door announcing how much money she'd made for the animal shelter. Today, she quietly slipped inside, hoping her father was still at work. The house was silent except for the gentle hum of the air conditioner. Sophia tucked the citation deep into her backpack and pushed it under her bed. Her eyes were puffy from crying, and her throat felt tight. How could she tell her dad she now owed $150? That was more money than she'd ever had in her life. She went to the bathroom and splashed cold water on her face, trying to erase the evidence of tears. In the mirror, she saw her grandmother's eyes looking back at her. "Be brave," she whispered to herself, something her grandmother used to say. The sound of keys in the front door made her stomach twist into knots. Later that afternoon, Mrs. Wilson knocked on the Chen's front door, holding a plate of cookies. "I couldn't stop thinking about what happened yesterday," she said when Michael answered. "Those cookies Sophia loves." Thought they might cheer her up. Michael invited her in. "That's very kind of you. She's been pretty upset." In the living room, Mrs. Wilson noticed the citation on the coffee table. "I was there when it happened. That officer was completely out of line. Several people recorded it. It's all over social media this morning." Michael's eyebrows raised. "It is?" "Oh yes, people are furious. Someone tagged the police department, but they just posted some statement about supporting officers' decisions in the field and upholding city ordinances." She shook her head in disgust. After Mrs. Wilson left, Michael went to his home office and closed the door. Unlike the rest of their modestly furnished house, this room spoke of serious success. Diplomas and certificates lined one wall. Harvard Law School, Bar Association honors, and a framed photo of Michael shaking hands with a Supreme Court justice. He sat at his desk and opened his laptop, quickly finding the viral videos of Sophia's encounter with Officer Hayes. His jaw tightened as he watched his daughter's humiliation play out from 3 different angles. The comments below the videos were overwhelming. Power trip much? Someone tell this cop to go solve real crimes. This is why people don't trust police. Michael picked up his phone and dialed a number. Judge Thompson's office, answered a crisp voice. Hello, Linda. It's Michael Chen. I need to speak with him. Michael, how's that daughter of yours? Still playing soccer? She is. Listen, is he available? It's important. A moment later, a deep voice came on the line. Michael, what can I do for you? Robert, I need some information about a police officer. Derek Hayes, badge number 4873. What happened? Michael explained briefly, his voice calm despite the anger underneath. I'm not surprised, Judge Thompson said. Hayes has appeared in my courtroom several times. Has a reputation for being overzealous, especially in certain neighborhoods. Has he been disciplined? Nothing that stuck. He's got protection from Captain Reynolds. They go way back. I see. Michael's voice was quiet, but determined. Thank you, Robert. Next, Michael called City Hall. Councilman Chen, we weren't expecting to hear from you today, the receptionist said brightly. Just checking if the Police Oversight Committee meeting is still on for next Thursday. Yes, sir, 2 p.m. as scheduled. Perfect. Please make sure Chief Garvey knows I'd like a word before the meeting. Michael ended the call and leaned back in his chair, thinking. Few people in town connected mild-mannered Michael Chen, who coached Little League and volunteered at the food bank, with Councilman Chen, who chaired the Police Oversight Committee and had argued 3 civil rights cases before the Supreme Court. He'd kept his professional achievements quiet around his neighbors, preferring to be known as just Sophia's dad. After his wife died 5 years ago, he'd scaled back his high-profile cases to be more present for his daughter. But he hadn't left the law behind, far from it. A knock at his office door interrupted his thoughts. Dad. Sophia peeked in. Are you working? Mrs. Wilson brought cookies. Michael smiled and waved her in. Just making some calls. Come sit with me for a minute. Sophia perched on the edge of his desk, munching a chocolate chip cookie. Her eyes drifted to the wall of accomplishments she'd seen her whole life but never fully understood. That officer was wrong about the permit, Michael said. I checked the city ordinances. Children under 16 running charitable stands are exempt. So I didn't break the law? Relief washed over Sophia's face. No, you didn't. In fact, he's the one who didn't follow proper procedure. Sophia tilted her head. Will I still have to pay the fine? Absolutely not. Michael took her hand. But more importantly, I want to make sure this doesn't happen to other kids. How can you do that? He's a police officer. Michael's eyes moved to the photo of himself at the Supreme Court. Because sometimes, Sophia, knowing the law is more powerful than enforcing it incorrectly. Are you going to use your super lawyer powers? A hint of a smile appeared on her face for the first time since the incident. Michael laughed. Something like that. That evening, as Michael prepared dinner, his phone buzzed with a text from Judge Thompson. Checked Hayes' record. 6 complaints in 2 years for similar issues, sending details. Meanwhile, across town, Officer Hayes was ending his shift when the desk sergeant called out to him. Hayes, heads up. That lemonade stand video hit 50,000 views. Chief wants to see you tomorrow. Hayes shrugged. It'll blow over. Always does. What Officer Hayes didn't know was that Michael Chen had spent the afternoon making calls to colleagues across the city, the district attorney, 2 judges, and the head of the Bar Association. By morning, everyone who mattered in the city's legal system would know about Officer Derek Hayes and his encounter with Councilman Chen's daughter. The hammer was about to fall, and Hayes had no idea it was already in motion. The next morning, Michael sat at his kitchen table surrounded by papers and his laptop. He'd been up since 5, reviewing everything Judge Thompson had sent over about Officer Hayes. The pattern was clear and troubling. He took a sip of coffee and made another note. 6 formal complaints in 2 years. 3 from small business owners in immigrant neighborhoods. 2 from teenagers at the skate park. And 1 from an elderly woman running a yard sale without a proper permit. In each case, Hayes had been unnecessarily harsh, but Captain Reynolds had dismissed every complaint. The doorbell rang. Michael opened it to find Tom Parker, a fellow lawyer and old friend. Got your message, Tom said, stepping inside. Brought those files you asked for. They settled in Michael's office where Tom spread out more documents. These are all the citations issued by Hayes in the last year. Notice anything? Michael scanned through them. They're mostly in the east and south sides of town. Exactly. Neighborhoods with more immigrants and people of color. Almost no citations in Westbrook or Hillside. Michael nodded grimly. Targeting specific communities. Classic pattern. There's more, Tom said, pulling out another folder. 3 months ago, a food truck owner filed a harassment claim. Said Hayes kept showing up, demanding to see permits, even after they were provided. The truck eventually left that location, lost too much business from Hayes's constant visits. Michael closed his eyes briefly. The food truck on Pine Street? The one with the amazing tacos? That's the one. Family moved here from Mexico 5 years ago. Saved for years to start that business. Michael's phone buzzed with a text from the district attorney, reviewed the video. That citation wouldn't hold up in court. Let me know how you want to handle this. Upstairs, Sophia had barely left her room since the incident. The videos had spread to her friends, and now everyone knew. She sat on her bed, staring at her phone. A text from her best friend Lily popped up. You coming to the park today? Everyone's meeting at 1. Sophia typed back, not feeling well. It was a lie, but how could she face everyone? What if Officer Hayes saw her again? The thought made her stomach hurt. A knock at her door. Her dad peeked in. Hey kiddo, want to talk? Sophia shrugged. Michael came in and sat beside her. Lily asked me to go to the park, she said quietly. I don't want to. Because of what happened? She nodded, eyes down. What if my friends think I'm a criminal or something? Michael put his arm around her. Your friends saw the video. They know you didn't do anything wrong. But what if he's there, or another police officer? Michael realized then how deeply the incident had affected her. His normally confident daughter was afraid to go outside. I understand being scared, he said gently. But we can't let one person's actions control our lives. It's easy for you to say, Sophia muttered. You're not afraid of anything. Michael smiled sadly. That's not true. I was terrified when you were born. Your mom and I had no idea what we were doing. And when she got sick, he paused. I was afraid every single day. Sophia leaned against her dad. How did you stop being scared? I didn't, not completely. But I learned that being brave doesn't mean you're not afraid. It means you don't let the fear stop you. Downstairs, the phone rang. Michael squeezed Sophia's shoulder and went to answer it. Mr. Chen, this is Anita from the Pine Oak Gazette. We're doing a story on the lemonade stand incident. Would you care to comment? Not at this time, Michael replied professionally. Are you planning to sue the police department? Our sources say you're a civil rights attorney. No comment. Michael hung up and sighed. The story was growing. His cell phone rang immediately after. The police chief. Councilman Chen, I just learned about the incident with your daughter. I want to assure you we're taking this very seriously. Are you? Michael's voice was calm but firm. Because your department's initial response was to defend Officer Hayes. That was before we understood the full situation. I'd like to meet with you privately to discuss this. I appreciate that, Chief Garvey, but this isn't just about my daughter anymore. I've uncovered a pattern of similar incidents. A pause on the other end. I see. Perhaps we should discuss that as well. After setting up a meeting for the next day, Michael returned upstairs to find Sophia putting on her shoes. I texted Lily, she said. She's going to meet me halfway to the park. Michael smiled. That's my girl. As Sophia headed out, Michael returned to his office. On his desk was a folder labeled Hayes Investigation. Inside was everything he needed to not only dismiss Sophia's citation, but to address the systemic issues that had allowed Hayes to abuse his power for years. The police chief might think this was going to be a simple apology and dismissal of the citation, but Michael Chen was preparing for much more than that. Tomorrow's meeting would be just the beginning. Across town, Officer Hayes was being called into Captain Reynolds' office, completely unaware that his career was about to unravel. The town hall meeting room buzzed with unusual energy. Wooden chairs that normally sat empty during monthly council sessions were filled to capacity. News of the confrontation between Officer Hayes and a 12-year-old girl had spread throughout the community, and people wanted answers. Michael Chen arrived 15 minutes early, dressed in a perfectly tailored navy suit. He nodded politely to familiar faces as he made his way to the front row. Few in the room connected this composed man with the viral video of the crying girl, exactly as Michael had wanted it. At the head table, Chief Garvey shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Their private meeting yesterday had not gone as planned. Instead of a simple apology and dismissal of the citation, Michael had presented a meticulously documented case showing years of Hayes' pattern of targeted harassment. The chief had expected a father seeking justice for his daughter. He hadn't expected to face a renowned civil rights attorney with evidence of departmental neglect. Officer Hayes sat 2 rows behind the chief, arms crossed and face impassive. Captain Reynolds had warned him to keep quiet and let the department handle the situation. Just a concerned parent making noise, Reynolds had said dismissively. It'll blow over. Mayor Winters called the meeting to order at exactly 7:00 p.m. After a few routine matters, she looked up. Next item. Public comment regarding recent police enforcement actions. We have several speakers signed up. Mrs. Wilson went first, her voice shaking slightly with nerves but firm with conviction. I watched Officer Hayes bully a child who was raising money for homeless animals. When neighbors tried to intervene, he threatened us too. Is this what our tax dollars pay for? Applause rippled through the room. 3 more community members spoke, describing similar encounters with Hayes. The food truck owner Michael had mentioned to Tom described how Hayes had driven him from his most profitable location. All the while, Michael sat quietly, reviewing his notes. Our final speaker is Michael Chen, announced the mayor. A murmur went through the crowd as Michael approached the podium. Those who recognized him from the neighborhood seemed confused by his formal appearance. Those who knew him professionally straightened in their seats, anticipating what was coming. Good evening, Michael began, his voice calm and measured. I'm here tonight wearing several hats. As a resident of Pine Oak Street, as a father, as an attorney, he paused, and as the chair of this city's Police Oversight Committee. Officer Hayes' head snapped up. Captain Reynolds, who had been scrolling through his phone, suddenly froze. Last week, my 12-year-old daughter was publicly humiliated and issued an improper citation by Officer Derek Hayes for operating a charity lemonade stand. Michael placed a copy of the citation on the podium. This citation violates the city's own Ordinance 5.32, which explicitly exempts children under 16 operating temporary charitable ventures from permit requirements. Michael looked directly at Hayes for the first time. Officer Hayes, were you aware of this exemption? Hayes glanced at Chief Garvey, who gave a slight nod. I was enforcing the General Vending Ordinance, Hayes replied stiffly. So your answer is no, Michael said. You weren't aware of the full ordinance you were enforcing. Hayes' face flushed. There are hundreds of city codes. Nobody knows all of them. I agree, Michael said reasonably. Which is why officers should exercise judgment and discretion, particularly when dealing with children. He turned a page in his notes. But this isn't about one mistake. In the past 2 years, you've issued similar citations to 17 different minors and small vendors. Interestingly, 14 of those were in predominantly immigrant or minority neighborhoods. A tense silence fell over the room. That's circumstantial, Captain Reynolds called out. Officer Hayes patrols those areas more frequently. Actually, Michael countered, I pulled the patrol schedules. He held up another document. Officer Hayes specifically requested those areas, despite living on the opposite side of town. Chief Garvey cleared his throat. Mr. Chen, we acknowledge there may have been an error in judgment in your daughter's case. The citation has been dismissed. But these other allegations are documented in complaints that were filed and subsequently buried, Michael interrupted, placing a thick folder on the table in front of the council members. 6 formal complaints in 2 years, all dismissed without proper investigation. This isn't about one citation. It's about a pattern of behavior that has been enabled by departmental negligence. The room erupted in murmurs. Mayor Winters banged her gavel. Order, please. Officer Hayes stood up, face red with anger. This is ridiculous. I enforce the law. That's my job. Your job, Michael said calmly, is to protect and serve the entire community, not to target those you think won't fight back. He turned to address the full council. As chair of the Police Oversight Committee, I am formally requesting an independent investigation into Officer Hayes' enforcement record and Captain Reynolds' handling of civilian complaints. I'm also proposing amendments to our city ordinances to prevent this kind of selective enforcement in the future. Hayes stared at Michael, the realization finally dawning on his face. This wasn't just an angry parent. This was someone with real power, power Hayes had never imagined when he approached a little girl's lemonade stand. As Michael returned to his seat, Mayor Winters looked at the stunned faces of the police department representatives. "Chief Garvey, would you like to respond?" The chief stood slowly, aware that every eye in the room was on him. "The department takes these allegations seriously. We will cooperate fully with any investigation." He paused, then added, "and Officer Hayes will be placed on administrative leave pending the results." The meeting continued, but Officer Hayes barely heard another word. He kept staring at the back of Michael Chen's head, wondering how everything had unraveled so quickly. All because he decided to throw his weight around with a kid selling lemonade. A kid who, it turned out, had a father who knew exactly how to fight back. 3 weeks after the town hall meeting, Michael sat in Chief Garvey's office reviewing the changes that had already been set in motion. The chief looked tired, with new lines around his eyes, but there was also a sense of purpose in his demeanor that hadn't been there before. "The independent investigation team starts Monday," Chief Garvey said, sliding a folder across his desk. "They'll review every citation issued by Hayes in the past 3 years, plus all the dismissed complaints." Michael nodded. "And Captain Reynolds, reassigned to desk duty while they investigate his role in burying those complaints. He's not happy about it." "I wouldn't expect him to be," Michael replied. The chief leaned back in his chair. "You know, when this first happened, I thought you were just another angry parent making noise." "Most people do," Michael said with a slight smile. "It's often an advantage." "I've been chief for 8 years," Garvey continued. "I told myself I was running a good department, but I missed this. Or maybe I just didn't want to see it." Michael studied the man across from him. He'd expected defensiveness, not this honest self-reflection. "The department-wide training on community policing starts next week," the chief added. "And we're implementing your suggestion about the Community Oversight Board for citation reviews." Outside the police station, a group of officers was helping set up tables for a community event in the park. Officer Rivera, a younger officer who'd spoken up during a recent department meeting about improving community relations, waved to Michael as he exited the building. "Mr. Chen, we're having a cookout this Saturday. The department's hosting. We'd love for you and Sophia to come." Michael nodded. "We'll try to make it." As he walked to his car, Michael reflected on how quickly things were changing. After decades of fighting legal battles in courtrooms, he was seeing real change happen in his own community. The police department was transforming from within, with several officers stepping up to support the new direction. Not everyone was happy, of course. Captain Reynolds and his supporters had pushed back, arguing that soft policing would lead to more crime. But they were increasingly in the minority as the community rallied around the reforms. At home, Michael found Sophia at the kitchen table working on a poster. Bold letters across the top read, "Kids' Rights Workshop." "What's this?" Michael asked, setting down his briefcase. "My school project," Sophia said proudly. "Mrs. Thomas said we could pick any topic that matters to us for our social studies presentation. I'm doing one about kids' rights and what to do if you're treated unfairly." Michael's heart swelled with pride as he looked at her work. The shy, frightened girl who'd hidden in her room just weeks ago was finding her voice. "I invited some police officers to come talk to our class," Sophia continued. "Officer Rivera said she would come. She said it's important for kids to know that most police want to help, not scare people." "That's very true," Michael agreed, sitting beside her. "How do you feel about that, having police come to your class?" Sophia considered the question. "I was nervous at first, but Officer Rivera is nice. She came to my lemonade stand last weekend and bought 3 cups. She looked up at her dad. One bad officer doesn't mean they're all bad, right?" "Exactly right," Michael said, giving her shoulder a squeeze. That evening, they attended a city council meeting where Michael presented the final draft of the amended permit ordinances. The new rules clearly stated exemptions for children's activities and non-profit ventures, with simple language that everyone could understand. These changes will ensure that no other child faces what my daughter experienced, Michael explained to the council. But more importantly, they address the uneven enforcement that has disproportionately affected certain neighborhoods in our city. The council voted unanimously to adopt the amendments. After the meeting, Mayor Winters pulled Michael aside. The Police Reform Committee needs a new chairperson, someone who can bridge the gap between the department and the community. Would you consider it? Michael was surprised. I thought you already had someone in mind. We did, the mayor said. Your handling of this situation showed exactly the kind of leadership we need. As Michael drove home that night, he thought about how one small incident, a citation given to a girl selling lemonade, had snowballed into community-wide change. Sometimes it took a small injustice to reveal a larger one. His phone buzzed with a text from Tom, heard about the Police Reform Committee offer. Taking it? Michael smiled. He hadn't yet decided, but he was leaning toward yes. The law had always been his tool for justice, but now he had a chance to prevent injustices before they required legal remedies. Meanwhile, across town, Officer Hayes sat alone in his apartment, staring at the disciplinary letter that had arrived that morning. His future on the force was uncertain, but one thing was clear. His days of unchecked authority were over. 6 months later, the community gathered at Pine Oak Park for the grand opening of the new animal shelter facility. Colorful balloons decorated the entrance, and a large banner hung above the door. Every animal deserves a home. Sophia stood proudly beside the shelter director, holding the ceremonial scissors for the ribbon cutting. This wouldn't have been possible without our top fundraiser, the director announced, smiling at Sophia. Her lemonade stand campaign inspired so many others in our community to help. The crowd applauded as Sophia, blushing slightly, cut the ribbon. What had started as a simple lemonade stand had grown into a community-wide fundraising effort that collected over $20,000 for the shelter. Michael watched from the sidelines, chest swelling with pride. The past 6 months had brought remarkable changes, not just to the police department, but to the whole community. The story of Sophia's unfair citation had sparked conversations about how rules were enforced and who they served. After the ceremony, volunteers served lemonade from a long table staffed by children from Sophia's school. Each cup cost $1, just like at Sophia's original stand, with all proceeds going to the shelter's medical fund. Chief Garvey stood nearby, chatting with community members. He'd become a regular face at neighborhood events since the reforms began. The independent investigation had revealed deeper problems than anyone expected, but instead of resisting the findings, Garvey had embraced them as an opportunity for genuine change. "Your daughter's quite the leader," the chief said as Michael approached. "Got the whole school involved in this project?" Michael nodded. She found her voice. Sometimes that's all it takes, one person willing to speak up. As they talked, Michael noticed a familiar figure hovering uncertainly at the edge of the gathering. Officer Hayes, no longer in uniform, stood watching the celebration. He looked different, thinner, with a humbled set to his shoulders that hadn't been there before. The disciplinary hearing had ended with Hayes being suspended without pay for 3 months. He'd also been required to complete extensive training on community policing and implicit bias before returning to duty. Today was his first day back on the force, though he'd been reassigned to a different district and reduced in rank. Michael excused himself from the chief and walked over to Hayes. "I didn't expect to see you here," Michael said. Hayes shifted uncomfortably. "I wasn't sure I should come, but I wanted to." He paused, searching for words. "I needed to make things right." Michael studied the man's face. The arrogance was gone, replaced by what appeared to be genuine regret. "Have you spoken with Sophia?" Michael asked. Hayes shook his head. "I wasn't sure that would be welcome. I don't want to upset her day." "Let me ask her," Michael said. He walked to where Sophia was pouring lemonade and spoke quietly in her ear. She looked over at Hayes, hesitated, then nodded. When Hayes approached the lemonade table, Sophia stood a little straighter. "Hello, Officer Hayes," she said, her voice steady. "Not officer today," he replied. "Just Derek Hayes. I came to tell you I'm sorry for how I treated you. There's no excuse for it." Sophia considered this. My dad says everyone deserves a second chance if they really want to change. Your dad is a wise man, Hayes said. Is that why you're still selling lemonade? Giving me a second chance to do the right thing. A small smile touched Sophia's lips. Maybe. Would you like a cup? It's for the animals. I'd like that very much. Hayes placed a $20 bill in the donation jar. Keep the change. As Sophia handed him the lemonade, a photographer from the local paper captured the moment, the former officer and the girl whose unfair treatment had sparked a community transformation. Later that evening, as Michael and Sophia walked home from the event, she asked, "Do you think he really changed?" Officer Hayes? Michael considered the question. People can change when they're given the right reasons and opportunities. The important thing is that the system changed. One person with power can't hurt people without consequences anymore. Sophia nodded thoughtfully. Mrs. Thomas says my school presentation on kids' rights is going to be used by other schools now. Is that true? It is, Michael confirmed. The school board approved it as part of the new civics curriculum. You're helping kids learn about their rights and responsibilities. Sophia grinned. All because I wanted to help some shelter dogs. Sometimes the smallest actions lead to the biggest changes, Michael said, putting his arm around her shoulders. You never know which cup of lemonade might change the world. As they turned onto their street, they saw Mrs. Wilson watering her garden. She waved enthusiastically. Saw your picture already on the newspaper's website, she called out. Our neighborhood celebrities. Michael laughed, just doing what's right. And that, Mrs. Wilson said with a knowing smile, is what makes all the difference. That night, as Michael tucked Sophia into bed, she asked one last question. Dad, are you glad all this happened? Even the bad part with the citation. Michael thought about the community coming together, about the police reforms that would protect countless others, about his daughter finding her strength and voice. I wish you hadn't been hurt, he said honestly. But yes, I'm glad that something good came from it. That's what justice looks like at its best, not just punishing wrongdoing, but creating something better for everyone. Sophia smiled sleepily. Maybe next summer we should sell cookies too. Michael laughed. One step at a time, kiddo, one step at a time.